Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
So pleased to welcome you to part 4 of a long series that we're doing titled Journey Through Time, Dialogue with Great Minds from History. And on our 4th program today, we have from the past a famous person named Herman Melville, who lived from 1819 until 1891. And of course, his masterpiece was Moby Dick. Herman Melville was born in New York City in 1819 and was with a merchant family. And his grandfather participated in the Boston Tea Party, among other things. And our guest today, Mr. Melville, attended Albany, New York Classical School, but he left school to work as a clerk, a teacher, and a farmhand. Of course, he became a very well-known and famous American author, and as I've said before, best known for his novel of the sea, and the one that was the masterpiece, Moby Dick. Mr. Melville, welcome to our time in history, and welcome to our program.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
And I'm very pleased to have a regular panelist, Erna Reinhardt, who is Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, and she will commence the questioning with Mr. Herman Melville.
Mr. Melville, welcome to the show and welcome to the 20th century, 21st century. Tell us a little bit about your childhood. You lived such an extensive life full of so many things, and we're going to get into those in a minute. But tell us about your childhood, where you were born, and a little bit about your family.
I was born in New York City, and my father was a merchant. But father did not do well in the import business and lost a fortune in it and then died, a relatively young man, leaving a wife and children to fend for themselves. And mother struggled mightily to send us to school, and she was able to on occasion. But my brother Gansford was the one in whom the family had the greatest hopes. And he was politically active. Went to England on a political appointment. Took my first book, Typee, Peep at Polynesian Life, with him. And hawked it around in London and finally was able to get it published. But hardly had that happened when poor Gansford passed away. And then the burden of the family fell on my shoulders. And it was not easy to support the family.
And at what age did you start to write?
Oh, I belonged to a debating society and in Albany, and we wrote little pieces, mostly foolishness, really. It wasn't until I got back after 4 years at sea, 4 years out of the sight of land for the most part, that I came home with a sea bag full of stories and told them to my sisters by the hour. And they said, you should write them. And I discovered that it was not hard to write them. And in less than a year, Typee was finished. And then came Omu and Mardi and Redburn and White Jacket. And in 5 years, I had 5 sea books. The last 2, Redburn and White Jacket, I wrote in one summer. I was a little embarrassed by them and told my father-in-law they were just 2 jobs done for tobacco money.
Yet we do want to emphasize your writings, and in addition to your great novels on the sea, you also did poetry, and so you have a very broad experience as a writer, and your talents extend in those different areas. I want to spend a little time on Moby Dick, which is today, in our time, is the one that is to be described as your masterpiece. But tell us several things. One is, how long did it take you to write Moby Dick, which was published, I believe, in 1851?
Right. It took about 2 years.
It was more challenged as far as time for you, wasn't it?
I took more time with it, though Hawthorne thought I didn't take enough time with any of my books. Though about Marty, the one that was less well received than any of the others, he said, at places Melville makes you swim for your life. And that's a nice accomplishment, compliment.
I was speaking as you're visiting our campus in our time today with a great librarian who is knowledgeable in many, many fields of literature, and she was smiling and saying, Mr. Hawthorne, when he really read your work, such as Moby Dick, really internally he was aware that the day would come when you would really be the one that, with the masterpiece as to works as an American author, and I think that's come to be true. But at the time you were alive, were you looked upon in the same status as Hawthorne?
Oh, I think Hawthorne was more respected and more read than I was. But his understanding of Moby Dick was a great comfort and great consolation to me. Hawthorne proved to me, I met him on a picnic to Monument Mountain. 2 or 3 weeks before the picnic, Aunt Mary had given me a copy of his Mosses from an Old Man's, and I hadn't read it. It was on my desk at the picnic. And then when I met him, I went back home and read through it that night and wrote a review that Everett Duyking took back to New York and published in his Literary World. And I said in that review that Shakespeare has been matched, that the darkness in Hawthorne is as great as the dark obscure of Shakespeare. And of course, these days, Shakespeare's are being born every day on the banks of the Ohio, I believe.
You said something really fascinating about Moby Dick. You once said, I have written a wicked book and feel as spotless as the lamb. That is my introduction to something for our viewers in the short time we have. Numbers of people in our time that read Moby Dick, I don't think possibly understand the characters and who really was your major character. Would you, in a brief way, take us through Moby Dick as to the characters and who was at the center of this, and the you've indicated in a presentation already, Mr. Melville, that there's a struggle going on with forces in the human being in Moby Dick.
Well, as I said, in order to write a great book, you must have a great theme, such as The Whale. Nobody can write a great book on the flea, though lots of people have tried. But as I told Hawthorne, you need a lot of sea room to write a great story. The only wall, some might remember my story, Bartle, the story of Wall Street. The only wall in that vast ocean was the forehead of the whale. And the whale is the main character in the story. He swims in an infinite ocean, is ubiquitous. He has been sighted twice, has been sighted many times, at the same time in different places, opposite poles of the earth. The whale is ubiquitous, which is kind of an immortality in place.
So you're suggesting in your story that the whale represented God?
I think so.
And how about the other characters in this? I know from what you said before that in your thinking, there's a lot of difference, and you had more respect for some of the characters and others that you placed in Moby Dick.
Well, I have a sympathy for all of the characters. Poor little Pip, the little black cabin boy, got in one of the whaleboats. And when the whale was harpooned and the line ran through, just brushed his arm and he leaped out. And they had to cut and lose the whale. And the captain of the boat said, "Do that again and we'll leave you." And he did it again. And they left him out in the infinite ocean. It was just by luck that the ship cruising behind the whaleboats pulled him from the water. But he had gone down in his spirit. The water kept his body up, but his spirit went down and saw God's foot on the treadle of the earth. When he came back, nothing he said made sense to anyone, as often is true of those with such experiences.
You had other major characters that were very complex and some that were very simple and you could see through them. Would you explain?
Well, the complex character, of course, is Captain Ahab, named from Ahab, who is described in the Bible as the most wicked king in Israel. Ahab lost his leg to Moby Dick, the great white whale, and hated the creature for it, formed a vengeance in his soul after his body and soul bled into one another as a result of the accident. He didn't see it as an accident. And he wanted to hunt Moby Dick to his death. And he did. But it was his death, not Moby Dick's, that proved to be the result. Some would say that he was guilty of great pride, of great hubris, of great overreaching. That was true of Mr. Starbuck, his first mate. He tried to show him that it was simply blind instinct, and it was blasphemy to hunt with such vengeance. And he said, I would strike the sun if it insulted me. Talk not to me of vengeance, man. A very powerful man, not cruel. I served under cruel captains. That's why I jumped ship in Nukuheva Harbor in the South Seas to escape from a cruel captain. But Ahab was not cruel. He was monomaniac. As in some degree or other, I think all of us are. We set our mind on something and hell and high water can't move us from that thing, whether it's good for us or bad. So like that, he was as complicated as the most complex of all of us.
What character was most simple that you could see?
Well, in another meeting this morning, somebody asked me to compare Ahab to Claggart in Billy Budd. And Claggart, I think, is not complex. He was simply malicious. And a man with a shriveled soul who couldn't abide the respect that was paid to young Billy because he was a handsome and good sailor. And so he formed a jealousy, which caused him to lie to the captain and say that Billy was fomenting rebellion on board, mutiny, and he wasn't. Alas, poor Billy was tongue-tied. The only way he could answer was with his fist, and that one fist dropped Claggart dead on the deck of the ship. And for that, Captain Vere thought Billy had to hang. But there are characters like that in our world, simply simple, one-dimensional characters. And so you must include them as well as more complex ones that are more fun to write about.
So your work is amazing in that way. It's really a reflection of life, and you do it within these novels. With that, Erna Reinhardt.
I want to talk a little bit about your life experiences, because travel and I think the water, the ocean, was a major part of your life. Share with us, in particular, your travels to the South Seas. You spent a lot of time there.
Yes, 4 years. On a whaler. I had traveled as a merchant, a boy, to Liverpool and back one summer. And then went out west to Guilin, Illinois to try to find work. I had trained and hoped to work on the canals, but there were no occupations. And so I went to sea again, and this time on a whaler out of Fairhaven, just opposite New Bedford in Massachusetts. And we went round Cape Horn. It was an easy passage for Cape Horn, just enough for a yarn or two. And then to the Marquesas Islands in the South Seas. And from there I went to Tahiti. And the Marquesas were untouched by civilization. There was a French man of war at anchor at Nukuheva when we arrived, but this was the beginning. But in Tahiti I saw what civilization had brought to the island and what the missionaries had brought. and I did not approve. From there, I got a whaler that took me to Honolulu in Hawaii, and there joined the Navy, simply to get a ride back home to Boston. So I have sailed in all three kinds of sailing vessels: the merchant ship, the man of war, where they look down on the merchant ship, and on the whaler, and they look down on the whaler too.
How many pieces of writing have you written? You've written so many books.
Well, the 6 sea books. Mm-hmm. And then the book that I tried to get even with my critics for Moby Dick on Pierre, or the ambiguities, and an historical novel, Israel Potter, and then poetry. In retirement, retirement from writing, I worked as a clerk in the customs office in New York for almost 20 years, and then wrote poetry in the evening. I wrote some Civil War poetry, published shortly after the war itself, and then wrote a long novel. Some say the longest, a long poem. Some say the longest poem in the English language, Claro. Short summary of the story is about a theological student who goes to the Holy Land to recover his faith, and can't do it. But then and now, in just the last few years, I have a new sea story, Billy Budd, a sailor, set in an English ship in the English Navy, but really based on a family story of a hanging at sea on an American vessel, and one of my cousins was one of the officers. Caused quite a scandal. Secretary of War, it was his son that was hung. And that inspired me to return, to deal with the great issues that I think are raised in not only the minds of men at sea, in this vast world above and all around, but also in readers who enjoy the sea.
I'm going to ask you now to read a poem. Our viewers would appreciate that while we have you in our time in which we live, and your very powerful works, including poetry.
Let me read a poem, brief poem from Battle Pieces. As you can see, is not a long book, but it is about the Civil War, and they're arranged in chronological order. This one is called Shiloh, a Requiem, April 1862. Skimming lightly, wheeling still, the swallows fly low over the field in clouded days, the forest field of Shiloh. Over the field where April rain solaced the parched ones, stretched in pain, through the pause of night that followed the Sunday fight around the church at Shiloh. The church so lone, the log-built one, that echoed to many a parting groan and natural prayer of dying foemen mingled there, foemen at morn, but friends at eve. Fame or country least their care. What like a bullet can undeceive? But now they lie low, while over them the swallows skim, and all is hushed at Shiloh.
Very powerful, and thank you while you're with us to share that with our viewers.
Thank you.
During your time, and you do all these writings, and I don't know whether this is a question that you really can answer. I often ask these kind of questions. It's like asking one, if you have several children, which one's your favorite? But of all your works, in your time when you were living, which may be very different from now, how we view your works, what are you most proud of in all your works?
Well, it must be Moby Dick, Although, you know, even Mardi, the least appreciated of all my, will find its audience someday. I loved it when Hawthorne said that you have to swim for your life at certain passages there. But I think I invested more in Moby Dick than I had in others. In Mardi, I told a sea story, but then turned it into a philosophical dialogue among the characters as they floated around the South Seas. But by the time I had gotten to Redburn and Whitejacket, and then to Moby Dick, I had learned to keep the story and the philosophy going at the same time. Particularly in Whitejacket, I was able to talk about the philosophical ideas while talking about life on board a man of war. And then Moby Dick, it followed much more easily, although there have been critics who said the story was good if you just left out all the philosophy, it would be better. And of course, that's why I wrote the story.
So you'd be asked to defeat your own purpose, that there is a philosophy in who you are and what you're trying to get across to others.
Exactly. There are readers that don't want to think while they read. They just want to read. I don't understand.
You weren't writing for those people.
No.
Here's a good moment to pause for, in our time, young writers. It's a fascinating point that you just made, and that is, as you mature as a writer, go through stages in your life, you indicated how you learned to, at the beginning you were separating the philosophy, but then you start integrating it. What would you say to young writers that are doing that too? Is this true about almost all writers, that you learn through that process how to better integrate and develop your works for the public?
I think there are very few writers in America who can support themselves by writing. It is the writer who makes the contribution to the country. The country doesn't make any contribution to the writer. And so we must praise American writers, and too many are still singing the praises only of English writers. Oliver Wendell Holmes and I had a big argument at that picnic on Monument Mountain that day. But Hawthorne has done well. But if a young person is foolish enough to try to make a living as a writer, then the only thing to do is to stay at it until he discovers his own way. And each writer will discover a different way. He must make time to write, but he must not neglect time to read. I understand that now there's a game in England at Oxford where they read Moby Dick and try to identify all the literary allusions, and they're still discovering them. They haven't found them all.
Well, they should invite you to their time and let you explain it to them. Erna Reinhardt.
Later in your life, Mr. Melville, you became a lecturer, and you traveled around and gave speeches. What were the topics that you spoke about?
I must say that this is the least successful thing I have done in life. I had traveled to Europe and was impressed with Roman statuary, so I lectured on Roman statuary. It was not a successful topic, but I thought that if Emerson could lecture, I could too. I was persuaded then to lecture a second year on the sea and tales of the sea, and that went a little better. The third season was canceled after 3 lectures. They said I mumbled, that I was distracted, and that I chose topics that were uninteresting. That's rather deadly in a lecture. So that's the story of my life. There were lots of people making very good living lecturing.
I have a technical question, and this is a little off the wall, but nowadays we use what we call computers, and before that we had typewriters. Tell us about what it was like to even write a book back in the 1800s.
Well, I wrote with a quill pen. Towards the end, though, I began to employ these newfangled pens that are made of steel. And you dip the pen in the ink and write until the ink runs out. And then, of course, when you want to correct, you scratch things out and write over them and squeeze it between the lines, and then you give it to your wife. I gave it to Elizabeth, sometimes to my sister, Fanny, and then they made a copy, a fair copy, we called it, for the publisher. And then from that, they set the type, one letter at a time, until the book was ready and it published. And of course, they saved the plates. Had the misfortune of having a fire in one of the warehouses one time. Lost books, which was not bad, but lost the plates, which meant it couldn't be reprinted.
On that note, I want to have our guest introduced, out of character. Mr. Herman Melville has been portrayed today by Dr. George Frein, who is a professor of philosophy and religion. He holds baccalaureate degrees in philosophy and in divinity. He has a master's degree in history and a doctorate in religion. He taught for many years as professor of philosophy and religion at University of North Dakota. He now lives in South Carolina and teaches there as an adjunct professor at Furman University. Dr. Frein, we're just about out of time, but this is your fourth trip to our campus,
yes.
New People, and
it's wonderful.
And we have about 30 seconds. What would you like to say to the audience out of character?
Oh, out of character, I would want to congratulate Tony Stewart and the whole staff and faculty here, from the president down, who I think is going to do a wonderful William Faulkner for you, really. Talked to him just before the last panel. He'll hate it that this is on the tape, but...
this commits him.
Yes, this commits him. And you are to be congratulated on getting your colleagues to do this. At the University of North Dakota, where I taught, they knew that I did this, and they were kind enough not to hold it against me, but I could have never persuaded one of them, much less dozens of them, to do as you have done, Tony, and you're to be congratulated for
You're just a master, and he does an incredible Mark Twain, among others. It's a wonderful format called the Chautauqua format. Thank you so much, George. It's always a pleasure being with you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll be with us again next week when we do part 5, and we'll have Mr. Herman Melville here with Frederick Douglass as in a conversation in part 5, and I'm sure you'll enjoy that. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.